Greetings and welcome to this week's episode of Bronx Bombers. My name is Joe Rubenstein and it is Wednesday, March 14th, and the Yankees have themselves a brand new infielder. Veteran second baseman Neil Walker, switch hitter, has some pop, solid defensively, and has a reputation as a clubhouse leader, so not bad for $4 million. I just hope that Tyler Wade can make the team as well, and maybe those two can platoon at second base. Tyler Wade's on-base percentage so far this spring is a healthy .387, and he's an absolute speed demon. He can really fly, and he's only 23 and costing us nothing. And by the way, for those who wonder about the importance of having a good farm system and the ability to have players come up from within, consider the fact that Aaron Judge and Gary Sanchez, 85 home runs between those two last year, will each make about $620,000 this year. And then think about all the money that the Red Sox have sunk into underperforming free agents, some of whom aren't even on the team anymore. And, you get the picture. You can follow us on Twitter @BombersPodcast is the handle. You can also send us questions. We'll try to answer each and every week in our mailbag segment here on the podcast. You can like us on Facebook, subscribe to our show on iTunes or Stitcher. You can also drop us a line if you like, 646-854-4959. And as always, you can send your comments and questions to joe@BronxBombersPodcast.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. Coming up a little bit later on in our Twitter poll this week, some interesting results when we asked your preference between advanced metrics and traditional stats, and I'll answer a fascinating question from one of our followers about who might provide that crazy energy on the bench now that Todd Frazier is no longer on the team. Also, Danny Torres, local sports writer and diehard Mets fan, will be rejoining the show for part 2 of our conversation, and we continue our deep dive into the top 4 pitching staffs in the American League. Today, we cover the Red Sox and the Yankees, all that and more, coming up on today's Bronx Bombers. Back in a moment.
Bronx Bombers Trivia. Which of these Yankees is not a member of the so-called Core Four of the 1990s? Is it A, Derek Jeter, B, Andy Pettitte, C, Mariano Rivera, or D, Bernie Williams? The answer coming up a little bit later in the podcast.
And now here's Joe with this week's main thing.
So last week, to kick off this deep dive into the top 4 pitching staffs in the American League, we talked about Houston and Cleveland. And today, we look at the Red Sox and the Yankees, comparing and contrasting their starting rotations and bullpens to see who comes out on top. And with no further ado, let's dive right in. Now, the Red Sox have at least one thing in common with the Indians. Their ace, Chris Sale, had a remarkable season, but was totally hittable in the playoffs, beyond hittable, actually. It's not really fair to Kluber to compare their ALDS performances. Sale was atrocious. In fact, his 8-2 loss in Game 1 against the Astros was the single worst postseason loss by game score in franchise history. But the truth is, his troubles started well before that. Starting in August, he wasn't nearly the same pitcher that he was earlier in the season, and maybe the Red Sox' second best pitcher, Craig Kimbrell, also had a phenomenal season, and also came up really small in the playoffs, giving up 2 runs in the 8th inning of the deciding Game 4, which enabled Houston to come from behind and win that game and clinch at Fenway. But the problem for Boston last year was that Sale was sort of like a fragile Band-Aid, covering up a lot of holes in that rotation. Basically, you had Chris Sale and a bunch of guys who, with the exception of Drew Pomerantz, were either injured, like David Price and Eduardo Rodriguez, or mediocre, as in the case of Rick Porcello. And I use the word fragile because the fundamental question with Sale, who, when he's on, he's as good as anybody, is durability. I mean, yeah, he pitched over 200 innings last year, but as I mentioned, he clearly hit a wall in August. That's how he actually ended up with a higher ERA than Severino. And whoever's followed his career knows this is not the first time that Chris Sale has hit a wall, it's the norm. If you combine his years in the majors, since he became a regular starter in 2012, His career ERA before the All-Star break is 2.74, and after, it's 3.28, and his home run rate goes up as well. And in the final month of the season, those numbers really skyrocket. In September, over his career, he has a 3.78 ERA and gives up 1.51 home runs per nine. Now, David Price, whose various off-the-field controversies I covered in some depth in episode 3, Price missed roughly 4 months with an unspecified elbow injury. Now, when he returned, pitching out of the bullpen, he was pretty good. But obviously, Boston, they're not overpaying him to be a reliever. So that's another big question right there. In fact, of all the major players on these 4 rotations, Price is probably the biggest question mark heading into the new season. And Rick Porcello proved last season what a lot of us suspected, which is that his Cy Young year of 2016 was a total anomaly. And it was. The year before that, his ERA was 4.92, third worst in the majors. And last season, it climbed back to 4.65, and he allowed more hits and homers than any other pitcher in the American League. So you can start to see why I get a little cranky when people talk about all the supposed questions facing the Yankees starting rotation and completely ignore what Boston is dealing with. Porcello and Price are getting paid major bucks and not giving any bang at all. But, their reputations remain inflated, and I think the fact that Boston has Chris Sale maybe mesmerizes people into thinking that their staff is some kind of powerhouse, and believe me, it's not. At least not recently. Now, to be fair, as I mentioned, Drew Pomerantz is an exception. He was good last season. 3.32 ERA, 1 strikeout per inning. He's now in his walk year. And Eduardo Rodriguez showed some occasional flair as well when he wasn't on the DL, but he had knee surgery in October, so he'll miss the first few weeks of the season. And the guy the Red Sox are probably going to use to replace him during that time, knuckleballer Stephen Wright, also had knee surgery last May, and then he was arrested in December on domestic assault charges, which Major League Baseball is still looking into. So, a suspension could be forthcoming. So questions, yeah, a few up in Boston. And a key guy in their bullpen down the stretch last year, Addison Reed, is now a Twin. And last year, even with Reed, the total whip of their combined bullpen arms, that's walks plus hits per innings pitched, so it's like an on-base percentage for pitchers, was the worst of all these 4 teams at 1.122. The Yankees was the best at 0.989, which is really remarkable considering Betances was handing out walks like nobody's business, and Chapman had troubles midseason as well. But for reasons I truly can't comprehend, the Red Sox, who desperately need a left-hander for their bullpen, passed on all the lefty relievers that were available this offseason, focusing their attention instead on overpaying J.D. Martinez, who turns 31 this summer. So they signed J.D. to a 5-year deal, $110 million. And his hitting, by the way, outside of Chase Field in Arizona last year, that's a total hitter's ballpark, really second only to Coors Field. His hitting outside of Chase Field was nothing remarkable. On the road, his batting average dropped over 100 points, and his OPS dropped a whopping 392 points. So look for some drop-off there. But if you look at these 2 teams, the Yankees and the Red Sox, obviously the Yankees bullpen is far superior, with Chad Green, Chapman, Robertson, Canely, Adam Warren all coming back. And a guy like Domingo Germán, who's been absolutely phenomenal this spring, could be another piece there. Hopefully Betances bounces back. Although, you know what? I'm not sure he'll ever be a guy you can really count on as far as consistency. But the Yankees bullpen was clearly the best of these 4 teams. And our starters versus Boston's, well, when you look at our 5 guys, Severino, Tanaka, Sabathia, Gray, Montgomery, versus the Red Sox staff last year, our combined whip of 1.197 was not only 42 points better than the Red Sox, it was the second best of all the 4 teams, behind only Cleveland. And as I mentioned, Severino's ERA ended up better than Sale's, and our staff was fantastic in the playoffs. Boston's was dreadful, other than Price, who pitched well in relief, but again, that's not why they pay him the big bucks. Now, the Red Sox and the Yankees have the 2 youngest starting rotations. Boston's average age is 28.4, the Yankees is 28.6, but the key difference there is the younger members of our staff, Montgomery, Chad Green, Severino, were all first-rate last year, and the Red Sox junior members still have a lot to prove. And what I like about our starting rotation is we've got guys that can give you innings, you know? Cleveland and New York, significantly better in this category than Houston and Boston last year. We've got youth, and our number one guy is also our youngest guy. Remember, Severino, who had the American League's highest average fastball velocity last year, is only 24. And we've also got a guy in left-hander Jordan Montgomery coming off a great rookie season and who's looked great in camp so far. And, he's only 25 years of age. Now, the questions with the other three are real. I don't deny that. Sabathia's age and his knees, Tanaka's inconsistency, and Gray's inconsistency as well, although obviously Gray had a much better year than Tanaka in 2017. And this year, he doesn't have to deal with all the off-the-field issues that come with moving across the country mid-season. And even with that on his plate last year, Gray's ERA was in the top 10 in the American League. And in Game 4 against Houston at Yankee Stadium, Gray held the Astros to only 1 hit and 1 earned run over 5+ innings. But honestly, the only starter I have even some concern about, or let's put it this way, I'm eager to have Tanaka prove that last year's inconsistency was a fluke. Now, Brian Cashman has apparently seen no need to go out and spend on another starter this offseason. But, should some of those questions I just mentioned rear their heads, he certainly has the payroll flexibility to make a deal in July. So to me, the Yankees staff was clearly better than Boston's in 2017. We proved it in the playoffs, coming within 1 game of the World Series. And when you toss in the best bullpen in baseball, the questions facing the Red Sox far exceed those facing the Yankees. And if you give any Red Sox fan some truth serum, they'll tell you the same thing. And again, Tanaka wasn't bad last year. He was inconsistent. People forget, mixed in with those few starts where he gave up all those home runs, was maybe his best start ever at Fenway in April, a 3-hit complete game shutout, total masterpiece. He also struck out a then career-high 13 batters against Oakland in May, then broke that with 14 against the Rays at the stadium, where he also had a perfect game going into the 6th. And then he struck out 15 against the Blue Jays in September. And with Sabathia, also a bit inconsistent, but a real team leader and absolute cash money after a Yankee loss. CC was 10-1 last year in games following a loss by the Bombers, the only loss being that horrible Game 7 against Houston. And Severino sort of flips the script of Chris Sale and Corey Kluber. Severino, who finished 3rd in the Cy Young voting behind those two guys, actually was better in the second half than he was in the first. After the All-Star break, he had a 2.28 ERA, 0.95 whip, and 11 strikeouts per 9. That's elite. And Montgomery, who I've praised before, had a really great rookie year. In fact, his 684 OPS against was second on our staff only to Severino, and among AL pitchers throwing at least 150 innings last year, he had the 13th best ERA, and so Monty actually outperformed a number of top-of-the-rotation guys on other teams, and got some well-earned Rookie of the Year votes for his efforts. And should one of those guys falter, and there's no good deals to be had, we've got internal options. 2 guys in AAA who may be approaching Major League readiness in Justice Sheffield and Chance Adams, but my choice would be Domingo Germán, who looked absolutely fantastic against the Mets last week in that come-from-behind win that was fueled by the Billy McKinney Grand Slam. And again on Monday against the Twins, he was also lights out. Germán, in 10.2 innings pitched this spring, has an ERA of 0.84 with 13 strikeouts. That's dominance, folks, and his fastball command has really improved. So look, all this being said, between these 4 teams, I'd say Cleveland, even though they lost some key pieces of their bullpen, has the edge overall just from the strength of their rotation 1 through 5. I'd put the Yankees and the Astros right behind them, but barely, and maybe give the Yankees a slight edge over Houston because our bullpen is clearly better. And I'd place Boston a bit back. Boston has the most question marks by far, with health and some off-the-field issues as well. But look, the proof is in the pudding, and thankfully, we'll start to get some real answers to these questions in about 2 weeks, at which point, we can stop speculating about what-ifs and maybes and spring training numbers and sink our teeth into a brand new season when the games really count. And that's a beautiful thing. Back in a moment. All right, back here on Bronx Bombers, and our featured guest once again is Danny Torres, freelance sports writer, Mets fan extraordinaire, an advocate for some of the great Puerto Rican players in Major League history. Danny's here with us for part 2 of our conversation, which we began with a question about the Mets pitching staff. Okay, starting rotation. Obviously banged up last year, 4th worst ERA in the majors at 5.14. Now Callaway's bringing in all the latest training techniques, cutting-edge medical protocols, hoping to keep this staff healthy and productive. Now everybody besides Steven Matz has looked pretty good so far this spring, especially Syndergaard. But, the big question, can he stay healthy? He missed most of last season, Matz and Harvey as well. Now, it's still pretty early, but the way I see the Mets rotation shaking out, Danny, assuming everyone's healthy, Jacob deGrom is your number 1 guy, and then after him, you've got Syndergaard, Vargas, the other left-hander, Steven Matz, Harvey, and then with Zach Wheeler, who's pitched well. He pitched 3 scoreless innings on Saturday in that loss to the Yankees, and Robert Gsellman, who's had a solid spring as well. Do you see both those guys, Wheeler and Gsellman, going to the pen, or do you think the Mets consider using one of them as a starter and maybe going 6-man rotation?
I would not be surprised, Joe, if the Mets decide to go a 6-man rotation. The player that actually had a problem with that 6-man rotation is no longer with the Mets, and he's actually on a minor league deal with the Texas Rangers, and that is John Neese, who basically is pretty much looking for a job, and hopefully he gets it. John Neese was, if he could just, pretty much as they say, get his act together and be able to perform. He's a lefty, and we all know that organizations love a southpaw, a left-handed pitcher. But I could conceivably see the Mets going with the 6-man rotation to see how these pitchers are going to be able to bounce back. The players that I mentioned earlier, your Harvey, your Matz, your Noah Syndergaard, all these guys are bouncing back from what? Injuries to their shoulders, whatever it may have been, and the time period that they were on the DL. So conceivably, yes, I could see a 6-man rotation. I wouldn't see that would be a problem. Let's even mention Seth Lugo, who pitched brilliantly in the World Baseball Classic for Team Puerto Rico. Again, comes back, there's issues with his shoulder. So I'm sure he's all healed up. And that's someone else, including Gsellman, that you could think of putting possibly, if you hope not, fingers crossed, that someone goes down, that even Rafael Montero. So there's a lot of possibilities with the 2018 Met rotation.
You're a major advocate for the incredible legacy on and off the field of Hall of Fame right fielder Roberto Clemente. Now, the issue of race in Major League Baseball didn't suddenly, disappear with the arrival of Jackie Robinson in 1947, obviously. It took years for non-white players to be fully accepted and to feel comfortable, and Clemente was someone who was not only dark-skinned, but unlike Robinson, from another country, knew almost no English when he arrived here, so in the 50s, that's a double disadvantage, and Clemente was no stranger to racism during his time in Pittsburgh. It's been noted in Ken Burns' baseball documentary and elsewhere that announcers and teammates referred to him as Bobby, not Roberto, for most of his career. Some local media in Pittsburgh engaged in, very stereotypical writing about him. Talk about this struggle for Clemente as the majors became more of the international league that we see today.
When it comes to Clemente, who played for the very first time for the Pittsburgh Pirates in 1955, interesting enough, the team that he faced was the Dodgers, the Brooklyn Dodgers. And you know that the Dodgers originally was the original team that had signed Roberto. And so it's ironic that he would face the Dodgers in his major league debut. I believe it was and Johnny Padres, 1955 MVP, was the pitcher, where he would get his first career base hit. But when you mention players of color, and yes, you mentioned Vic Power, you could bring up Orlando Cepeda, Juan Marichal, Felipe Alou. You can go on with so many extraordinary ball players. But the one thing that I really, really, really appreciated from those ball players, they knew they were in the United States, and they slowly but surely learned to speak the language. And sometimes you wonder, you say to yourself, and what things are stated politically correct, things of that nature. But these are players that knew, if now my career was going to be in the United States, I want to know what they're saying. I want to be able to respond to them in their language, because guess what? I am here. And Roberto slowly but surely had an opportunity to learn the English language. Someone that, a player who's still alive, former Pittsburgh Pirate player who I got to know, Bob Friend, was instrumental in Roberto's early part of Roberto's career because he introduced him to a gentleman by the name of Phil Dorsey. Phil Dorsey worked in the Postal Service. Phil Dorsey also was in the Army Reserve. And Phil Dorsey, Pittsburgh native, black gentleman, African-American gentleman, was Roberto's friend throughout his 18 years. And I got a chance to know his dear son, Phil, also named after his dad, and listening to stories that Phil shared with me, that's the son, because I actually wrote to Phil Dorsey, the one that knew Roberto, that befriended Roberto, and 4 months before he died, I received a letter back. And I remember all these stamps that he was a Korean War veteran, and 4 months later, he passed away, and I ended up finally meeting his son, and actually I just spoke to his son recently. But he was so instrumental in Roberto's life because he got a chance to acclimate Roberto to the American culture. He would take Roberto to the movies. He loved to play pool. He loved to play poker with Roberto. He answered Roberto's fan mail. He would take Roberto to the airport. He would take care of Roberto's kids. He would do everything for Roberto. He had access to the clubhouse. So he really was that right-hand man that Roberto needed while he was in the United States, while he played for the Pittsburgh Pirates, along with players that slowly but surely became very close to Roberto. Doc Ellis, Al Oliver, Willie Stargell, guys that spoke the English language, but also were African-American players.
Now, you have a personal relationship with another great player, Sandy Alomar Sr., played for the Yankees in the mid-'70s, phenomenal defensive second baseman, and of course the father of an even greater one, Hall of Famer Roberto Alomar. Talk about Sandy's career as a ball player and a little about that friendship.
I do not remember Sandy, the ball player. I could only talk about Sandy, the coach. Sandy was actually 1 year a New York Met. He played, I don't know how many games it might have been, between 30 and 40 games in 1967. So he actually was a New York Met for one moment. But we know his career with the California Angels, with the New York Yankees in '76. But the person that I know is the person that, and I hope Sandy doesn't mind that I say this, but Sandy Alomar Sr., I receive a text message from him for almost close to 2 years every single day. And you might say, wow, for someone to text you every single day, well, what does he have to share? It's not necessarily, well, at times it is that simply a good morning, a good afternoon, a good evening text. But there are inspirational quotes. And I remember when I mentioned this to Sandy Jr. last year when I was at Yankee Stadium, he said to me, well, Dad doesn't send me those quotes because he knows what I'm doing, but I guess he feels that I don't need those inspirational quotes considering what I'm doing as a coach for the Cleveland Indians. But he must really like you if he sends you those messages, because I know he sends them to my wife, I know he sends them to my kids, and I know he sends it to those that at the end of the day that mean a lot to him. And I'm just looking at my phone right here just to share with the audience. And just, again, you could get a sense of who the man is. Not only the baseball coach, who Alex Cora, when was given the job as the manager of the Boston Red Sox, there were two people that he credited, Terry Francona and Sandy Alomar Sr. So what does that tell you? That someone that's crediting someone that is, I know he works as a special instructor with the Toronto Blue Jays, but someone that was so instrumental in his career. And I'd really certainly hope that Alex Cora has a phenomenal season with the Red Sox moving forward. But this is something that Sandy Alomar shared with me today. Some people will try to spoil your happiness just because they have nothing better to do and because they are unhappy with their own life. Stand your ground. And, you know, we have another quote that he also sent to me on Saturday. Forgiveness is the economy of the heart. It saves the expense of anger, the cost of hatred, the waste of spirits. And again, this is something that I get from Sandy daily. I greatly appreciate it. I will forward them to my contacts, especially my daughter, who loves quotes. I forwarded to her as well. And again, that just tells you the makeup of Sandy Alomar Sr.
Okay, 2 more questions, a Yankee question and a Mets question. I'm always interested in getting opinions on my team from non-Yankee fans, because I think a lot of the time you'll get a more objective response. What's your take on this Yankee club heading into the season?
Well, I will tell you this. I'm sure the Yankee hierarchy are smiling at the amount of money that they're making even before the first pitch at Yankee Stadium, simply because of the players that they have. And the 2 players that we're talking, my friend, are Aaron Judge and Giancarlo Stanton. So advanced ticket sales, I'm sure, have been going through the roof. So if we're talking simply terms of what those 2 players are bringing, then guess what? You've got some serious firepower there. You've got a combination of quite possibly, hey, we could say 100 home runs in a season between the 2, I would think. But then listen, don't they say pitching is what wins championship games? So you look at the pitching staff of the New York Yankees moving forward. I am so happy because, number one, he's a really nice guy. I like nice guys. But I'm glad they brought CeCe back. A veteran presence on that staff. Obviously, Tanaka, smart man, did not opt out simply because, guess what? There is a comfort level at Yankee Stadium. Why would you chase the buck when you already know how close this team almost went to the big show? So you look at the acquisitions in the offseason, you look at the players that have stayed behind. Come on, if there's one player that has stepped up big time since basically Derek Jeter said sayonara, is Didi. Look at what Didi's been able to do for the New York Yankees, for their fandom. He's a great guy, very personable, but obviously he's turned around quite nicely. Could I have said that might have happened with another organization? I don't know. It's just amazing that sometimes you wonder how a player is going to live up to the uniform that you're playing for the New York Yankees. That's a little scary. But Didi's been able to make a smooth transition, and I'm very happy for him. At the end of the day, the Yankees decided that Girardi wasn't going to be a part of their plans moving forward. Girardi's going to take it easy right now. But you don't tell me that Girardi moving into 2019 is going to be back in the dugout. Absolutely. Because you know what? The guy's a winner. Look what he did with the Marlins. Look what he did with the Yankees. Come on. You got a World Series out of him, but you can't necessarily point all the fingers at Girardi. It comes down to the players. But you know as well as I, a manager is expendable. But at the end of the day, Girardi's going to pick up somewhere. I would tell you one thing. If I were the Mets, oh, man, I just hate when it's always, and now it's the fan talking at me right now, that when it's always the Yankees picking up a Met player, and that Met player will obviously do phenomenal. Let's talk Darryl Strawberry. Let's talk Doc Gooden. I mean, we can go on and on. But simply, how sweet that would have been if the Mets would have said, you know what? Let's bring Girardi over there. But I understand. But Girardi's a winner. And I certainly hope that he's going to be able to pick up where he left off with another organization.
All right, final question, Danny. Vegas came out with their bids on Major League win totals, and the Mets, who won only 70 games last year, the Mets, the odds makers have them at 81 wins this year. And with the exception of the Giants, that's the biggest leap forward for any team. So obviously the pros in Vegas liked what they saw this offseason from the Mets. But are you taking the over or the under on the 81 wins, keeping in mind the fact that, yes, the Marlins will be terrible, but the Phillies have definitely improved, especially with the addition the other day of Jake Arrieta, and the Braves could be decent as well, and of course the Nationals are still the Nationals.
I will say this, Joe, and it's, again, I love the questions you've been throwing at me, and I do have something else that I want to add, and I will get to that, but I want to mention one thing. I look at where baseball is today. Analytics, sabermetrics. And more you're starting to see your old school manager disappear from Major League Baseball. Dusty Baker, a straight shooter, very personable with the press, and is very knowledgeable. I don't know how many times manager of the year, but at the end of the day, it goes down to being able to get to the big show. And unfortunately, he didn't. But the win and loss record with the Washington Nationals and other teams that he managed. But let's face it, he's proven. He's won wherever he's gone. And I'm going to tell you one play, and that's without analytics and sabermetrics. Of course, I'm sure they fed him some numbers throughout the course because guess what? That's where baseball is today. So as a manager, yes, you have to already within the last 5, 6, 7 years have to be familiar with this. But there's one Yankee, without a doubt, that I always enjoyed watching. And that's not enjoying watching the player, but it was the manager. And you probably already know who I'm talking about. Alfred Manuel Billy Martin. And that, my friend, simply was managing from the gut, knowing the game, knowing your players. And I will tell you this, I'm certainly hoping, maybe even praying, that part of the game isn't going to be lost. This whole thing with a clock, the game is going too long, all of this, it's affecting the beauty of the game that you and I, Joe, so love. And I certainly hope, Joe, that you and I can continue to enjoy that till the day we are no longer on this planet, because for me, that is the beauty of baseball. Now, you're talking about where my Mets are going to be moving forward in 2018. They're saying 81 wins. I'll tell you this, my friend. I'm not saying 90, but I'll tell you right now, give me at least 89. You're going to tell me that you're going to replicate the amount of injuries or what we experienced in 2017, that's why the key possibly might be the 6-man rotation. Because at this point, you could say, all right, we're still trying to slowly but surely increase the innings numbers of our players, of our pitchers, and slowly but surely get to where, guess what? If we're in the playoffs, you've been able to salvage those arms. You're not hitting that 200-inning plateau, because if you're going into the playoffs, guess what? You're going to need arms. And there are plenty of arms with the 2018 Mets. And I'm certainly hoping, yes, I write, but I'm certainly hoping as a fan that I'll be able to experience some playoff baseball in Flushing at Citi Field.
All right, Danny, it's been a real pleasure having you with us. You do great work. Love your writing. And good luck to your Mets when they're not playing us. Thanks so much for being part of the show. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely, Joe. And it was a pleasure to be with you. And I say hello to your dear friend in this this studio of yours. Hello, Roxanne.
Yes, Roxanne is my cat, by the way, who turns 8 years old today. Big Yankee fan, and she's a good girl. All right, we'll come back. More Bronx Bombers in just a moment.
And now the answer to today's Bronx Bombers trivia question. Which of these 4 players, Derek Jeter, Andy Pettitte, Mariano Rivera, or Bernie Williams, was not a member of the Core 4? The answer? D. Bernie Williams. The 4th member was Jorge Posada. And now here's Joe with this week's Twitter poll.
Yes, this week's Twitter poll results are in. We asked you this. Which do you prefer, traditional stats or advanced metrics? And 49% of our followers on Twitter at Bombers Podcast said traditional stats, 43% said a mix of both, and only 8% said advanced metrics, which surprised me. I thought advanced metrics had made some more inroads than that. Now, personally, I guess I'm in that 43% that said that prefers a mix of both. And I use both on the show, but I do understand some of the issues that fans have with advanced metrics. First of all, it seems like there's 5 or 10 new ones every year, right? I mean, and all of a sudden last year's 5 or 10 are garbage. So fans basically have no chance to build up familiarity before they're faced with a whole new learning curve. That's the sort of thing that can and maybe is creating a backlash because, you know, fans get tired of it. If sabermetricians are that changeable, that fickle, you know, it makes fans maybe lose their faith in the entire enterprise, which may be an overreaction by the fans, but I think that dynamic is real. I also think that people in that community tend to think that advanced metrics are bulletproof, and they're not. I mean, for all the revolutionary aspects of what Billy Beane did in Oakland in the early years of this century, I mean, you know, he's still GM there, right? And they haven't exactly been a rip-roaring success since then. And, you know, for a while you would see articles excusing this, saying that the A's had been historically unlucky. But then, you know, after several seasons of the A's being dreadful go by, you have to wonder, you know, either the A's have had season after season of historically unlucky years, or there's something that advanced metrics overlooked, or we're just plain wrong about. Now, I do think advanced metrics are clearly better than traditional stats at explaining what has happened because they do account for more variables that are crucial. I mean, walks, for example, are completely ignored by the batting average statistic. And, walks lead to runs and runs lead to wins. But the fact is that generally speaking, advanced metrics aren't much better than traditional stats at telling us what will happen. Because the variable they don't account for, because they can't, is change. Right? I mean, players, will tinker with their swing like Aaron Judge did, and all of a sudden they're smashing 52 home runs. Others, for any number of reasons, will deteriorate. And so the past can be an unreliable indicator of future performance. And just to back this up, I dug up some predictions from last year on sites like Fangraphs, Pacoda, hardcore advanced metrics sites. Their predictions or projections, as they like to call them, for the 2017 season. And what I discovered was these sites, with all their pinpoint metrics, were no better at predicting the Yankees' success last year than anybody else, right? I mean, Fangraphs, which is maybe held in the highest esteem, their forecast had us finishing just 2 games over 500 in third place, 3 games back of the Blue Jays. When, we actually finished the season 20 games over 500, 15 games ahead of the Blue Jays. Pacoda had us doing even worse. Baseball Prospectus, CBS Sportsline, none of those sites had us finishing higher than 4th place. But again, as far as the positive aspect of advanced metrics, the reduction in importance of the batting average stat compared to the metric of OPS, that's a positive thing in my opinion. OPS factors in both on-base percentage and power hitting, so it really is the best stat to judge a player's offensive prowess, way better than batting average, which again, I use it on this show mostly because it's a familiar frame of reference, but in addition to ignoring walks, the other major flaw with the batting average stat is it assigns the same value to a single that it does to a home run, which is absurd. I mean, the fact that the so-called Major League batting champion is judged solely on the merit of his batting average is ludicrous and something that really needs to be changed. For example, in 2001, Larry Walker of the Colorado Rockies was the so-called batting champion because his batting average was .350 and Barry Bonds was .328, which is insane. First of all, despite the fact that Walker played in the single best hitter's park in the majors, Coors Field, he hit 38 home runs that year, Bonds hit 73. But more importantly, Bonds had an on-base percentage that season of .515. Okay, we're talking Ted Williams territory, and that's 66 points higher than Walker's, and his slugging average was over 200 points higher. Okay, RBI totals higher as well. And Larry Walker's the batting champion. Now that doesn't pass the smell test. But there are other advanced metrics where I'm not as much of a fan. The wins above replacement stat is far from perfect in that, it's impossible to prove. This mythical replacement player who just happens to play every position, doesn't exist. And the stats that advanced metrics people will use to come up with wins above replacement are weighted or not weighted based on the statistician's discretion. So it's very imperfect. And I've also never understood why advanced metrics people frown on the idea of a clutch hitter when they absolutely do exist. But a lot of advanced metrics people will claim that there isn't even a way to evaluate it. Of course there is. You just analyze performance within certain parameters. Men on base, late in the game, close score, postseason. And if you do this, you do find players that were clutch. Since we're talking Yankees here, I'd say Derek Jeter certainly falls in that category. I think Thurman Munson as well. And if you want to go further back to the 50s, a prime example, maybe the best example, at least for the Yankees, would be Billy Martin, who was an ordinary hitter at best during the regular season in his career, but whose postseason numbers were superb. This is a guy whose career on-base percentage was .300. That's mediocre. But in the postseason, it was .371. His career slugging average was .369, but in the postseason was .440. And before people start screaming about small sample size, since the Yankees were so good when he was on the team, which is 1950 to 1957, he played in 5 World Series, 3 of which, against Brooklyn, went to 7 games. So actually, it's a pretty hefty sample size. Billy Martin played in 28 postseason games with 105 plate appearances. And in addition to being maybe the toughest out in some of those lineups, I mean, his career postseason OPS, that's on base plus slugging, was better than Mickey Mantle's, okay? But he was also a big contributor in the postseason defensively. He had that famous game-saving catch in Game 7 of the 1952 World Series. And then the year after that, Martin was the World Series MVP, hitting .500 in that series against the Dodgers again. 12 hits, including 2 home runs, 2 triples, and a double in those 6 games, and the game-winning single in the decisive Game 6. All right, from this week's mailbag, our question of the week here on Bronx Bombers comes from Simon in Scarsdale. And by the way, the email is joe@bronxbomberspodcast.com, or you can find us on Twitter, @BombersPodcast is the handle, or leave us a message at 646-854-4959. If you have any questions you want to have us answer on any future episodes, we are more than happy to do so. And Simon says, sorry, I couldn't resist. I think the Yankees made a mistake not re-signing Todd Frazier. I know he wanted 2 years, but if we go out and get Machado next year, we could have used him to back up Bird at first. One of my favorite things about Frazier was the energy he brought to the dugout, in addition to getting some really big hits in the playoffs. My question is, with Todd Frazier now a Met, who's going to bring that crazy energy to the clubhouse this year? That's a great question. We were just talking about clutch performances. And as Simon points out, Frazier did have a couple of big hits in the playoffs. Although, you know what? Overall, I don't know. I mean, he hit .235 against the Indians, and he didn't hit at all against Houston, just .182. So not great. But my likeliest candidate for bench energy might be Didi. He seems to have that swagger, that devil-may-care attitude. Comes up really big in big spots. Big home run in that wild card game last year off Irvin Santana. 2 off of Kluber in Game 5 in Cleveland. But, you know, who knows? It could be a guy that plays a much lesser role. In fact, it usually is. You know, when you think of the 96 Yankees, the names that come to mind are Bernie Williams, David Cone, Derek Jeter, and so on. But a guy you may have forgotten, unless you followed that season, and I watched or heard every game that year, is Mariano Duncan. Duncan was a utility infielder who played for 6 different major league teams, and then Torre hired him as his first base coach when he was managing the Dodgers. And Duncan kept everybody loose. His version of the thumbs down that Frazier started last year was the catchphrase, "We play today, we win today, that's it." And that's what Duncan would say repeatedly in post-game interviews, and it became kind of the team mantra, and they had T-shirts made up and so on. Now, I say he played a lesser role, and he did. He only played in about 100 games that season, but he contributed. I mean, that was his only full season with the Yankees, and he hit .340 with 56 RBIs. Now, as far as the Yankees not signing Frazier to a 2-year deal, there I disagree with you, Simon. I think it was the best move. And the idea of paying him $8.5 million next year to be a backup first baseman, I don't like it. And in fact, one of the big standouts in camp this year, Tyler Austin, who can hit the ball a freaking ton. He hit an absolute bomb to dead center off ex-Yankee Phil Hughes on Monday night. Austin can fill that role, and a lot more cheaply than Frazier would have. He also had the game-winning home run against the Braves last week, and is a righty batter with opposite field power, which is a very good thing at Yankee Stadium. And he looks good defensively as well. And look, I'm sure Frazier is going to be a nice addition to the Mets this year. And given the fact that the whole thumbs down thing started with a Mets fan at Citi Field, whose name is Gary Denier. That's a great name. Actually, now he's universally known as the thumbs down guy, and his likeness is now going to be used on a bobblehead. But the fact that Frazier ends up a Met is pretty hilarious, isn't it? I mean, Denier was the guy in the stands at Citi Field in the aqua blue shirt and suspenders with this kind of blank, dazed expression on his face, which, can you blame him? The Mets did that to a lot of their fans last year. But he gave the thumbs down after Frazier hit a home run in Citi Field. And a reporter actually tracked him down last month and asked him about the Frazier signing. And he said, quote, "It's a whole new chapter in the wonderful world of thumbs down." I think it's great that Todd Frazier is going to be playing with the Mets, and I'm certainly looking forward to him motivating his new teammates like he did last year, unquote. And thumbs down guy is making some cash off of this. I think he gets a percentage of the bobblehead sales. And why shouldn't he? I think he's a court office assistant. They can't make too much scratch, right? So good for him. But as for your question, Simon, I'm afraid my answer at this point has to be time will tell. But with such a young team of high-energy guys, it's going to be somebody, right? And he may not even be a Yankee at this point. He could be a mid-season trade like Frazier was. But thanks, Simon. That's a great question. And that'll do it for this week's episode of Bronx Bombers. Again, don't forget, subscribe via iTunes or Stitcher, rate and review this podcast, follow us on Twitter @BombersPodcast is the handle, like us on Facebook as well, and most of all, have faith in the Yankees. We'll see you again next week.